you. Well, welcome everybody to the 250-year celebration of Amazing Grace. On behalf of Brisbane City Temple Salvation Army, we want to welcome you. My name is Lachlan, and this is my wife Emily. We will be your hosts this evening. Thank you, Bandmaster Michael Cooper and the Brisbane City Temple Band. There will be more music and singing and storytelling this evening as we share about the life of John Newton and the rise of his hymn, Amazing Grace. These words capture the testimony of its author, John Newton, who experienced the depths of despair but found redemption and personal relationship in God. Although it was originally penned in 1773, today we celebrate that Amazing Grace tells John Newton's story whilst echoing the human desires for forgiveness, salvation, and abundant life through Jesus Christ. But before we go any further, let's give thanks. Please join me in prayer. Dear God, we give thanks to you for another beautiful day in the city of Brisbane. Thank you for bringing us together today in spirit of celebration and gratitude as we reflect on John Newton's life. We ask for hearts and minds open to your love, guidance, and challenge. Amen.
We also want to give thanks to God for the lands on which we're able to meet today. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, and their continuing relationship to this land. This evening we are meeting on Mianjin, which literally means spike in Turrbal language, and that literally refers to the shape of the CBD we are gathering on. We are committed to seeing God's goodness on the land that we live in. And it's no question that when we stop and appreciate the city of Brisbane that we're gathering in, we can only be grateful. We are also grateful to have the opportunity to join and appreciate the hymn Amazing Grace, a song which is being performed and recorded by thousands of artists in multiple languages and an enormous range of genres. This hymn holds a profound significance for many people, estimating to be played over 10 million times each year. So this evening we ask, what do you know about John Newton? And where did Amazing Grace come from? Let's journey together and unpack the story. Newton's youth was marked by religious confusion and a lack of moral self-control and discipline. He lived an incredible life of daring drama, rebellion, and fighting with God. John Newton was born in 1725 in Wapping, Britain, near the Tower of London. And as a child, his mother had prayed he would become a minister and had taught him daily scriptures and many children's songs written by Isaac Watts. At 11 years old, Newton began going on sea voyages with his father, a merchant navy captain. Growing up, John was well exposed to a world of exploration and trade. And when he was 16, John's father arranged for John to travel to Jamaica and train as a sugar plantation manager. No doubt a plantation worked by enslaved people. However, before departing, he fell in love with a young lady named Mary Cartlett, leading him to extend his stay in Britain and miss the job opportunity.
His father found him another job as a sailor on a merchant ship, travelling between England and Europe. On returns from his voyages, he went to see Mary's family, hoping to be considered as a prospective husband. The answer was no. Again, he stayed longer than he should have and lost his job once again. On a later courting visit to Mary's family, whilst out walking, John was set upon and forcibly conscripted to the Royal British Navy. John's navy ship was about to sail to the East Indies for 5 years. Stopping in at Plymouth, John learnt that his father was nearby. He left the ship without permission to ask his father to get him out of the Navy and give permission to marry Mary. On return to the Navy, he was imprisoned, whipped as punishment, and degraded in rank due to profanity, gambling, and drinking. The 20-year-old Newton seemed to be deliberately alienating himself from his crew and captain. The troublesome John Newton was soon transferred to a passing slave ship working off the African coast. He was mistreated and forced to beg for food and live in shackles for 2 years. During this time, John managed to send out letters to his father and Mary. Now that John was 20 years old and a shackled slave, thousands of miles away from home, morality seemed but a distant memory. Now please welcome the voices of Birralee under the direction of Jenny Moon.
Our next song is called There Are Always Miracles, and the music is written by Australian composer Sam Weiss. The words are inspired by Holocaust survivor Eddie Yaku, who described himself as the happiest man on earth. Eddie was born in Germany and under the Nazis was sent to Buchenwald concentration camp and later to Auschwitz. Having narrowly survived, he moved to Australia during the 1950s, where he dedicated his life to teaching others about the dangers of intolerance. "This is my message, as long as I live. I'll teach not to hate," he wrote in his autobiography. "Life is what you want it to be. Life is in your hands," he said. "You know, happiness doesn't fall from the sky. It's in your hands. You want to be happy? You can be happy." His memoir, called The Happiest Man on Earth, chronicled his extraordinary tale of survival. It described how towards the end of the war, Eddie Yaku escaped a death march from Auschwitz and hid in a cave in a forest where he survived by eating slugs and snails. Eventually, he managed to crawl to a highway where he was rescued by American soldiers. It was then that he decided that the best revenge would be to live and enjoy life. Eddie chose to make his life a testimony of how hope and love can triumph over despair and hate.
So if we remember back, John Newton is enslaved in West Africa. However, after receiving his letters, John's father solicited the help of a friend to ask his ship's captain sailing to Sierra Leone to search for John and bring him home. In early 1747, the captain of the Greyhound located the now 22-year-old John and began the journey back to England, a voyage that would change his life. John started to read some religious books on this journey, in particular Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ. Then, in the middle of the night, John awoke to find himself caught in a violent storm. The boat was in great danger of sinking. One crewman who had already taken his place had been swept overboard. Although he manned the vessel for the remainder of the journey, Newton later commented that throughout the storm, he realised his helplessness and concluded that only the grace of God could save him. Prodded by what he had read, Newton took the first step towards accepting religion. In the words of his hymn, this incident marked the hour I first believed. He prayed for God's mercy, and the storm died down. And after 4 more weeks at sea, the Greyhound finally limped into port in Loch Swilly in Donegal Island. On return to England, John discovered that his father was now supportive of his marriage to Mary. Newton immediately wrote to the Cartlet family to plead his case for Mary's hand, although he could offer her no financial security. When Mary said she'd consider his proposal, he returned to careering slaves to better his fortunes.
He worked on this time on a ship full of slaves bound across the Atlantic to Charleston, South Carolina. He encouraged sailors under his charge to pray rather than taunt them for their beliefs. He also began to ensure that every member of his crew treated their human cargo with gentleness and concern. However, it would be another 40 years until Newton openly challenged the trafficking of slaves. Newton was finally able to get agreement from Mary Cartlet to marry him. This was 1750 and John was aged 25. Only God's amazing grace could and would take a rude, drinking, profane, slave-trading sailor and transform him into a child of God. Newton never ceased to stand in awe of God's work in his life. This is amazing grace. Now please welcome the BCT Contemporary Group led by Jaden Ivers and special guest Kate John.
Well, thank you everyone. This is the time where we ask for audience participation. A time where you guys get to sing along, and maybe even throughout this concert you guys can actually stretch your legs. So we're going to sing a song that's called This Is Amazing Grace. Now this is a song that you can hear throughout many churches. It's been out for a little while, but it speaks of how God and His grace saves us. I don't know if you're a Christian, but we are here at the Salvation Army Brisbane City Temple. We believe that Jesus loves you and that He came to save and that His grace is more than enough for us. So we're going to sing. If you know it, I invite you to sing. So I just invite you to stand, and if you don't know it, just clap. If you don't know it, mime. That's all right too. But we're here to have a good time.
Stronger, the King of Glory.
Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. And worthy is the Lamb who was slain, and worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain, and worthy is the King who conquered the grave. And worthy is the Lamb who was slain, and worthy is the King who conquered the grave. And worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy, worthy. This is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You laid down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Thanks, everyone. You can have a seat. You did great.
Thank you, BCT Contemporary Group. Well, let's continue this story, shall we? 3 years after his marriage, Newton suffered a stroke, preventing him from returning to sea. On his recovery, Newton took several land jobs in the port of Liverpool and also exploring Christianity more fully. As Newton attempted to experience all the various expressions of Christianity, it became clear to him that he was being called to ministry. During the 7-Year War, Newton was the tide surveyor at the port of Liverpool. The war meant that maritime traffic was reduced, so he had large portions of time to meet with preachers and evangelists, such as George Whitefield and John Wesley. On his 33rd birthday, Newton decided to join ministry full-time, working on behalf of the church and for Jesus Christ. Since Newton lacked a university degree, he could not be ordained through normal channels. However, the landlord of a local parish was so impressed with Newton and his writings about his conversion that he offered the church to Newton, who was then ordained in June 1764. John and his beloved wife Mary moved to a little town of Olney. At the age of 39, John Newton began 43 years of preaching the gospel of Christ. He took his duties seriously, preaching tirelessly and to largely poor congregations. He spent his mornings in Bible study and afternoons visiting local church members. There were regular Sunday morning and afternoon services and meetings for children and young people. There was also a Tuesday evening prayer meeting, which was always well attended to.
John had hoped to be able to preach without notes, but in the early years he found he would often lose his train of thought. He found that he needed to prepare well and would write out his thoughts in notebooks first. For the Sunday evening services, Newton would often compose a hymn that he'd developed through the lessons in scripture for the evening. The hymns were written to use in his church, filled with mainly poor people and uneducated followers. In 1767, the poet William Cowper settled in Olney, and he and Newton began a lifelong friendship. William Cowper was referred to as one of the greatest poets in the history of the church, remembered famously for coining the phrase, "Variety is the spice of life." In 1773, Newton's New Year's Day message was from 1 Chronicles 17:16-17, recounting David's amazement that his descendants would be set on the throne of Israel, despite his unworthiness of such an honour. It was for this sermon he penned the hymn first called Faith's Review and Expectation, called today Amazing Grace. Now, please welcome the BCT band led by bandmaster Michael Cooper.
At age 54, Newton left Olney to lead the Church of St. Mary, Woolnoth in London, close to his birthplace. Here, Newton ministered to the poor, the merchant class, and the wealthy and influential. William Wilberforce was strongly influenced by John Newton's life and preaching. Newton would remain a spiritual mentor from the prominent abolitionists of someone who was against slavery for the next 20 years. In 1787, Wilberforce met with a group of activists and abolitionists against the slave trade. They were persuading Wilberforce to take on the cause of abolition, and he soon became the leading English abolitionist. Newton joined the fight for the abolition of slavery by publishing a very influential essay called Thoughts Upon the African Slave Trade. Newton, speaking strongly from his own experiences, also proposed that the captors were in turn brutalised by their callous treatment of others and cited offences including torture, rape and murder.
A bill abolishing the slave trade in the British Empire received royal assent on March 1807. Wilberforce and others continued to press for the abolition of all slavery. The bill achieving this was not passed until July 1833. Newton on his deathbed was believed to have been rejoiced to hear the wonderful news. Although there is no direct link between the hymn Amazing Grace and the abolition of slavery in Britain, the hymn was written by a man who was moved to speak out against something from which he had once profited. In an essay, Newton said, "I hope it will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me that I was once an active instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders." Thus it seems fitting that his hymn Amazing Grace has become, for so many, including those fighting for civil rights, an anthem against all forms of injustice. Now please welcome the Temple Singers, led by Matthew Brown.
happens, please feel free to join in.
Thank you so much. We are now going to hear from our guest speaker this evening, Commissioner James Condon. Commissioner Condon and his wife Jan have served for 45 years in the Salvation Army as officers. Currently, James Condon is the chairman of the Australian Freedom Network, whose goals are to raise awareness, collaboration, action and support against anti-slavery work in Australia, starting with faith communities. Would you please warmly welcome Commissioner James Condon to the stage?
Thank you. What a great afternoon, and it's so good to be here and receiving inspiration and blessing and challenge. Now, I assume to some extent you are like me, you have a mobile phone, and when it rings, you wonder who it is. But if it's a late enough version, it will tell you if they are in your phone book. I had 2 such phone calls recently. 2. Rendell Williams was one, inviting me to speak this afternoon, and the other one was a gentleman by the name of Craig Stiles last Tuesday. Now, when it rings and it doesn't tell me who it is, I think, will I answer it? Or let it go to message bank? I'll find out later. So this phone call on Tuesday from Craig Stiles was one of those phone calls. I didn't know who he was. So I rang him back and I found out that Craig Stiles is a film producer on the Central Coast, based on the Central Coast of New South Wales. And he was ringing me because of my chairmanship of the Australian Freedom Network and ringing me because of my work with the Salvation Army and with Destiny Rescue. And I'll touch a little bit on all of those this afternoon in the time I have. He said this, and I quote, "While filming the World Airline Conference at the Sydney International Convention Centre, where approximately 180 airlines were represented, he was shocked to hear that the biggest challenge to world airlines was the trafficking of women and children on commercial airlines. The trafficking of women and children on commercial airlines around the world." Now, Craig has, because he's a film producer, he's produced a documentary about this, and he has sent me all the details about it, and it'll soon be released in theatres across Australia. Craig told me 50 million people are trapped in slavery today. And you can check that out. Google, no matter who it is who's reporting, will give you that figure of 50 million people trapped in slavery today. The other figure he mentioned to me was 40,000 in Australia. 40,000 in Australia trapped in slavery. Let me break up some of those figures. 11 million in India, 6 million in China, 2 million in Russia, 2 million in Indonesia, 1 million in the USA, 40,000 in Australia. Now, your little brochure, which is given with your program, will tell you something about the Salvation Army's work and the Safe House. And it also gives you some idea of a definition of slavery. Because I can quote all these figures, but what are you thinking about? What does it mean to be a slave? Someone who is owned by someone as property and forced to live and work as dictated by that person against their will. Now, I've already said that Craig is located on the Central Coast of New South Wales, and he said to me that local women from his church who minister in the brothels on the Central Coast have indicated there are numerous girls in brothels on the central coast of New South Wales who've been trafficked. Craig, as a result of his film production work, now runs an organisation called Get Free. In all my research in preparation for this afternoon, it may surprise you to learn that slavery today is more prevalent than at any other time in modern history. 75 to 80% of slaves are trafficked and enslaved for sex, and $99 billion is generated by sex trafficking in the world each year. You may well ask yourself the question, how can that be? How can that be? And that's a good question. Now, mention has already been made of my chairmanship of the Australian Freedom Network, and I mentioned I sit on the board of the Sunshine Coast charity Destiny Rescue. And I was asked by the founder of Destiny Rescue to sit on the board in my retirement. They are involved in 12 countries around the world, rescuing young girls from human trafficking, and we are always expanding to new countries. For those of you that are Salvationist and have a Salvationist heritage, you may be interested to know that our CEO is Paul Murgard, originally from the Murgard-Toft family from Bundaberg. He wasn't the CEO when I joined the board, but he is now, and he's doing a great job. I receive regular reports of young women being rescued, reports that move me, inspire me, and challenge me. Last year, Destiny Rescue, we are a smaller organisation, but we rescued 12,000 girls from human trafficking in the 12 countries we work in. Now, as far as the Australian Freedom Network is concerned, the Global Freedom Network was launched by Pope Francis on the 2nd of December 2014. It was an initiative of Andrew Forrest, our Australian mining magnate. And then, on the 2nd of December, at Parliament House in Canberra, the Australian Freedom Network was launched and I became the chairman. The Australian Freedom Network is a network of faith leaders from across Australia who work to challenge slavery in Australia. We signed in the Federal Parliament on that occasion a declaration against modern slavery. The purpose of our network is to raise awareness of slavery in Australia among the churches. Secondly, to unify faith-based organisations to collaborate on ending slavery in Australia, to inspire people to engage with the issues of modern slavery as an extension of their faith, and to encourage faith-based agencies to take meaningful action to end slavery in Australia. And one of the significant achievements of the Australian Freedom Network was to see the introduction of the Modern Slavery Act 2018, supporting what has already been referred to this afternoon as the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. I had so many meetings at Parliament House in Canberra with representatives of all parties, all together, wanting to see the legislation passed, and it was passed in 2018. And of course, Andrew Forrest and myself were very involved in that. But you may not know this. On the 25th of May this year, a review of the 2018 Act was tabled in Parliament, making 31 recommendations to strengthen the Act to ensure that we tackle the scourge of modern slavery both at home and abroad. Now, briefly to the Salvation Army. I was Chief Secretary of the Salvation Army in Papua New Guinea, and we returned home to be Chief Secretary of what was the Australian Eastern Territory in March 2008. And in June 2008, nothing to do with me, but I was privileged to be there, the Salvation Army launched a safe house for victims of human trafficking in Sydney. It's the first in Australia, and it is still the only safe house for victims of human trafficking in Australia. Your leaflet in your brochure tells you quite a bit about it. And there are many great stories of men and women being rescued from human trafficking, going on to faith in Christ, and indeed becoming members of the Salvation Army. And some of you may know the great story of the Philippine lady who was one of the first to come to the safe house in Sydney and connected with the Salvation Army, came to faith and became a soldier of the Salvation Army at Dulwich Hill Temple. That is but one story. I was greatly encouraged recently to read that the Salvation Army Australia has appointed Major Melanie Ann Holland, and I checked this title out with her to make sure I got it right, to this new role. Melanie has been appointed as the Modern Slavery and Anti-Human Trafficking Territorial Contact Person. And I know Melanie Ann Holland, as some of you will, and she's the right person to really get in and inspire, challenge, and urge the Salvation Army on to do even more. Just as I move towards the close of my presentation this afternoon, just let me highlight what the Salvation Army is doing in Australia. I've already mentioned the safe house. The Salvation Army advocates with decision makers who have the power to implement social policy change. And if you've been around the Salvation Army for a while, you'll know that we have a national secretariat in Canberra. And when I was there just a couple of months ago, I was pleasantly surprised about the team that is now placed in there advocating with the government for policy change in so many areas. The Salvation Army in Australia is a member of the National Roundtable on Slavery and Human Trafficking. And here, this afternoon, the Salvation Army operates the Australian Freedom Fund, which provides grants for survivors and people at risk of modern slavery. The Salvation Army Australian Freedom Fund. Of course, time doesn't permit me to talk about what the Salvation Army does internationally. I know through my work with Destiny Rescue, and particularly I think of one story out of South America, where the Salvation Army works so closely with Destiny Rescue as it has in India and in Africa. I want to leave you, as I close this afternoon, with a verse from Jeremiah chapter 22 and verse 13. Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness and his rooms by injustice. Pretty strong words. Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness and his rooms by injustice. So, what shall we do? What will I do? What will you do? I leave you with this challenge. Pray, give, and act. It's a scourge on our society. I leave you with that challenge to pray, to give, to act. Thank you for the opportunity this afternoon.
Thank you for that, James. That was excellent. And we are actually now going to take up a time for donations. If you would like to potentially give towards the mission of the Salvation Army in our anti-slavery capacity. I do apologise. The BSB account number on the screen is not the clearest we've ever seen. So if you are struggling to read that, you can, after it is in the brochure. It is on the back of the brochure. So if the screen is tricky for you, it is in the back of the brochure. But we are going to have the BCT band play another song for us while we take up this time of offering. And we invite you to, reflect on the words that we've just heard. We are so lucky at the Salvation Army to be a church that gets their uniforms dirty and is actually involved in trying to not just share the love of Jesus, but actually do that practically. And so this is one of the spaces that we're so lucky to be a part of and to really see things changing, whether it be in Canberra or across the world. So thank you. So why has Amazing Grace lasted 250 years in our hearts? We can all agree that the hymn lyrics are incredibly powerful and provide a universal message of hope and redemption. Over the years, the lyrics were attached to several different traditional tunes, but in 1835, 16 years later, composer William Walker added the lyrics of Amazing Grace to a recognisable tune called New Britain, and the tune stuck. This has become the standard version of the Amazing Grace hymn that we all know today.
However, it wasn't until the hymn crossed the United States that its popularity grew, particularly amongst the Protestant churches. The song also became a well-known anthem for the US civil rights movement and gained popularity among those protesting the Vietnam War. During the 1960s, it was sung at many Martin Luther King Jr. rallies by Mahalia Jackson. The song achieved pop culture prestige when Aretha Franklin recorded it on her best-selling gospel album of the same name. Over the years, musicians, singers from Elvis Presley, Andrea Bocelli to Celine Dion, even Destiny's Child, Judy Collins and Leanne Rimes have also performed this song. A Broadway musical about the song even debuted in 2015. Now please welcome back the Voices of Birralee.
Well, I trust you have enjoyed this afternoon. It's been a great afternoon of music, a great afternoon of just being able to sit and listen, and I'm sure you enjoyed that. But also an afternoon of just understanding the meaning behind that song, Amazing Grace, but the journey that Isaac Newton went on himself to write that song and his own journey against slavery. Has been a good afternoon, and there's been many people involved in putting this together. First of all, we do want to thank the Birralee Voices under the direction of Jenny Moon. Thank you, girls. Thank you, ladies. Obviously, with a group like that, you can't forget the accompanist on piano, djembe, and the flute as well, so thank you. Also from our own musical groups here at Brisbane City Temple, our band, our singers, and the worship team, so thank you everybody for your involvement there. Of course, we've got, where is she? Kate's hiding somewhere. Kate John, oh, she's there. Yeah, thank you, Kate, for coming along. You'll hear more of Kate very soon. Commissioner James and Jan, got to acknowledge Jan as well. You come as a team, don't you? So Commissioner James, we thank you for your words today and just the real life stuff that you put to slavery isn't an old issue. It happens today. So we thank you for just that enlightenment that we have, knowing that we need to be acting today. So a reminder for anybody who may want to continue just to support the work of the Salvation Army. When we conclude here today, out in the foyer, there will be the tap and go machines. If you want to make a donation there, you can do that. I'm sure they'll be able to take some cash donations out there as well. But again, thank you, James, for your words today. We do need to just acknowledge the tech team who are here, those who kind of sit behind everything that happens. So thank you guys for all that you do up there. But of course, an afternoon like this is nothing if we're doing this to an empty room. So to all of you who have made the journey to be here, we also acknowledge that there are those who are watching online as well. This has been live streamed today. So to each of you, we thank you for just being engaged with this afternoon. If you are interested in anything to do with what has been spoken about today, feel free to talk to somebody. If it's somebody in a uniform, we're from the Salvation Army here at Brisbane City, and we're more than happy to chat about any of those things if you've got questions, or we can point you in the right direction. If you are interested in exploring the Christian faith any further, in the back of your seat you'll probably see a little flyer there, a little card talking about Alpha, which is an introductory course talking about what is the Christian faith all about, and there's a few options there on how you can be involved. But if you're interested in that, feel free to use that. We're going to conclude this afternoon with everybody being involved, and obviously the Salvation Army here, we are people who bring the name of Jesus first and foremost to everything that we do. We're going to conclude with singing this song, Amazing Grace. It's been arranged by our own Tennyson Hall, so thank you, Tenny, for arranging this. But this will include everybody to be involved. And I'm sure that as we go along, you will sing along in your seat there with us. But we want to say thank you for joining with us today in this Amazing Grace celebration. May you know the amazing grace of God in your life, and I pray that that will be something that you recognise and understand for yourself.